Thank you very much, Shakti, for this extraordinarily generous invitation and the opportunity to speak at this particular juncture. This is a book that has been a very short book that has been in the making for a long time, and I hope the results are not entirely disappointing. I'm going to divide my talk into three distinct segments. First, I'm going to talk about the standard explanations that are put forward mostly by apologists for Pakistan, who suggest that Pakistan faces genuine security threats, which has led to the kind of behavior that it has engaged in. And then I will proceed to debunk those explanations. And then provide, secondly, an alternative explanation of what actually has driven Pakistan's behavior towards India and has sustained the rivalry with India, a rivalry that under any rational conditions, Pakistan cannot reasonably expect to win. And third and finally, I will talk about the conditions and the strategies that might end the impasse between India and Pakistan. So these then constitute the three central foci of my talk. The standard explanation that most apologists for Pakistan, including fairly sophisticated individuals who have a fair understanding of the Indo-Pakistani relationship and the existence of hostilities between India and Pakistan, have made the following argument: that India's sheer size and military capabilities poses an existential threat to Pakistan, that Pakistan's very existence is at question because of India's sheer capabilities and the sheer asymmetry between the two countries. And consequently, Pakistan, as the weaker state in the region, which also lost a significant part of its territory in 1971, feels compelled to balance Indian power, and thereby has to come up with various strategies, either internal or by drawing in external powers to balance Indian power because of the overweening nature of India's capabilities. Of course, Pakistan's insistence and the insistence of Pakistani apologists that India broke up Pakistan in 1971 tends to overlook, for the most part, Pakistan's own complicity in that particular tragedy. That discussion, for the most part, is absolutely absent in Pakistani political discourse. With rare exceptions, few Pakistanis can come to grips openly with the fact that it is particular choices that they made that contributed to the tragedy of 1971 and thereby led to Indian involvement. The fact that 9.8 million people fled over a period of a few months faced with the genocidal behavior of an army, that has never been frontally confronted in Pakistan. Not even the Hamadur Commission report, which significant portions of which have been leaked and are now available publicly, confronts the role of the Pakistani military in producing the tragedy of 1971. And in popular discourse, there is still this inordinate focus on India's role in breaking up Pakistan. And even sophisticated observers from Pakistan, like Hussein Haqqani, in a recent book, carefully culls out a handful of statements made by the Indian leadership, including Prime Minister Nehru, in the early 1950s, that Pakistan is mostly an aberration, and at some point the Pakistanis will come to the realization that partition was a terrible idea and that the two wings will, the two parts will eventually be integrated. And he uses these handful of statements, which he selects and culls very carefully, to suggest that these statements constituted the basis for Pakistan's deep sense of insecurity. Yet, if you look at the historical record, it's not India, but Pakistan that initiated the first war over Kashmir. One only has to look at a book by Major General Akbar Khan called Raiders in Kashmir, where he willingly admits the complicity of the military in precipitating the war in the first place. The other variant of this argument is that the Pakistanis also fear that India could at some point cut off the headwaters that flow into Pakistan. First of all, there is the Indus Waters Treaty, and India has a fairly good record of adhering to international accords. But apart from that, a talented Pakistani scholar, Aqil Shah, has pointed out in a book on civil-military relations in Pakistan, a book of very recent vintage, that in the 47-48 war, Pakistan captured those areas of Kashmir which were critical in terms of obtaining the river waters that flow into Pakistan. So the notion that India could economically strangulate Pakistan after 1948 simply is not tenable, because the areas from where the water flows was actually captured by Pakistan and remains in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir even today. And of course, then there's a variant on this argument that Kashmir is, quote, the unfinished business of partition. Certainly, one could make, from a Pakistani standpoint, one could make this argument until 1971. But after 1971, when you were unable to hold your country together, cohere your country on the basis of Islam alone, what business do you have to lay a claim on Kashmir merely because of its Muslim majority status? If a Muslim majority status could be the basis of nationhood, then certainly 1971 laid that to be completely a barefaced lie, because religion alone could not be the source of national cohesion. Clearly, linguistic nationalism in East Pakistan proved to be much more of a vibrant force and ultimately led to the collapse of the country, India's intervention notwithstanding. So what then is the alternative explanation? If it's not this idea of an existential threat, or the necessity of controlling the headwaters that flow into Pakistan, then what is the basis of this unremitting hostility towards India? It principally stems from the structure of the Pakistani state. One of the great achievements of India, current discussions, the present discussions about civil-military relations aside, one of the great achievements of the Indian state, right from the very outset, was the subordination of the military to civilian authority. And this was possible largely because of the structure and the organization and the ideology of the Indian nationalist movement, which was a democratic movement and which enjoyed widespread popular legitimacy. And consequently, the very military that had been used to oppress India until the 14th of August 1947, on the 15th of August 1947, was turned into a nationalist army. And there was firm civilian control, which was legitimized by elections as early as 1952. This was never accomplished in Pakistan, and on the contrary, right from the very outset, there was a nexus that developed between the higher echelons of the civil service in Pakistan, an extremely elitist civil service, not dissimilar to the civil service that India inherited, but with the advantage of democracy. In Pakistan, that never quite happened. And a nexus was forged very early between the higher levels of the civilian bureaucracy and the military, that they understood best how to govern the country, and they referred to politicians in the country who seemed incapable of maintaining public order as scalawags. And that's the exact British term, English term that was used by senior bureaucrats to describe politicians, because politicians seemed to be more interested in squabbling and produced chaos, and there was disorder in the streets, none of which was seen as particularly tolerable or attractive to these to the military brass and to the civilian bureaucrats, who preferred an orderly society and a society which would be hierarchical and would respect the authority enjoyed by the civilian bureaucrats and by the military. And not surprisingly, as early as 1958, Pakistan had its first military coup. The military, from the very outset, long before it seized power in 1958, saw it in its interest to exaggerate the threat from India, to embroider the threat from India, to inflate the threat from India, because this proved enormously beneficial to the military to accrue substantial resources, to the point that currently close to 40% of the national budget of Pakistan is devoted to defense, and about 30% to debt servicing, and the remainder for every other purpose. This is not a sustainable strategy. If Pakistan was a genuinely security-seeking state, if it was a state that was only concerned about the preservation of its national security, then this military would have responded to a series of overtures from India at particular junctures about the possibilities of reducing tension. And the book covers a period when an extensive array of overtures were made by a range of governments of different ideological persuasions in India between 1999 and 2009, none of which ultimately produced any meaningful results, despite the talk that a 4-point formula had been reached by about 2007, and were it not for the fact that ultimately Musharraf was overthrown in 2007 because of popular protests, that one might have seen a breakthrough. I am deeply skeptical of this particular formulation, for the simple reason I am yet to see any kind of incontrovertible evidence that tells us that Musharraf enjoyed the support of the various corps commanders. In the absence of the support of the military for this so-called 4-point formula that had been drawn up, one wonders what kind of credible commitment Musharraf might have been able to make to India that would have lasted beyond his tenure in office. I have scoured the literature and have looked at any available public source that would confirm to me that Musharraf had obtained the confidence of his corps commanders in terms of his ability to ensure that there would be suitable support for this 4-point formula, which would lead then ultimately to a resolution of the Kashmir dispute, the central bone of contention between India and Pakistan. So to go back to my central point, that if Pakistan was merely a security-seeking state, it would not repeatedly and periodically resort to provocations against India. It would respond to the fact that India, at particular junctures, has reduced troops in Kashmir, but it has not elicited a reaction in Pakistan that would suggest that their security concerns were now assuaged because of Indian troop reductions, because of the Indian willingness to make certain kinds of concessions. And consequently, The changes in troop deployments, the changes in force postures, and the changes in doctrine are unlikely to bring about a change in Pakistani military attitudes towards India. Instead, what the military has done is that it has turned Pakistan, and that's a central argument of the book, that into a predatory state. It is a state that is unhappy with the existing political order in the region and is intent on the alteration of that political order through the use of asymmetric warfare. And this, of course, has been facilitated by Pakistan's acquisition of nuclear weapons, because any time India considers a significant conventional response to Pakistani provocation, the possibilities of nuclear escalation are always there, particularly with Pakistan having spelt out various red lines which could then potentially trigger a nuclear conflict. And that in many ways has paralyzed Indian decision-making until very recently in terms of responding to Pakistani provocations. So the hostility towards India does not stem from security seeking or the anxieties of a weak state, but from the desire of the state and from the structure of the state that seeks territorial aggrandizement and is unsatisfied with the status quo in South Asia. So how might this rivalry, this situation of almost unyielding hostility finally come to an end? Under at least one condition, I think, is almost critical for this rivalry to come to an end, and this is a point I discuss at considerable length in the book. At a bare minimum, you need the Pakistani military to be discredited in some fashion. As long as the military, to use a Latin expression, remains primus inter pares, first amongst equals, there is no possibility of a breakthrough. Am I suggesting that this is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for a rapprochement? No, but it is absolutely a necessary condition. In the absence of the military's role being downgraded within Pakistan, no initiative on the part of India or multilateral initiatives on the part of the great powers is likely to result in a transformation of the relationship, because the military's corporate interests are likely to be undermined by a rapprochement with India. The extraordinary privileges that the military has managed to accrue over an extended period of time would be significantly attenuated were a breakthrough to take place with India. And as long as this peculiar structure of civil-military relations persists in Pakistan, the possibilities of a rapprochement are blighted. One actually saw two possible moments when there could have been a breakthrough. The first was after 1971, when the military had been thoroughly discredited because of the level of blood on its hands, the extent of blood on its hands as a consequence of the 1971 war. But sadly, the political leadership under Bhutto frittered away that window of opportunity. Bhutto got involved in any number of internal disputes, corrupt practices, inept choices, and as a consequence, the support that he had enjoyed for a brief period of time with the military thoroughly discredited was quickly squandered, and thereby that window closed quite effectively for decades thereafter. And the second episode, of much lesser significance, but certainly something that put the Pakistani military in a state of some discredit, was the revelation that Osama bin Laden had been living for years together on the very edge of a military cantonment in Abbottabad. And if anyone knows anything about military cantonments, particularly, in fact, across South Asia, not just in Pakistan, one knows that the commandant of such a cantonment generally has fairly good intelligence on the comings and goings of individuals and would not be oblivious to the sudden acquisition of a major property on the edge of a cantonment where none of the inhabitants seem to move in or out of the compound and remain utterly oblivious to the presence of this individual or individuals. So it boggles the mind to read the Abbottabad report that this was merely an organizational and institutional failure that that enabled Osama bin Laden to live with impunity for years together in Abbottabad. It was an extraordinary public relations exercise which the Pakistani military orchestrated, which absolved itself of any possible responsibility and thereby avoided the military from being discredited, because this was clearly a most egregious act to harbor one of the world's most wanted terrorists imaginable right in its very bosom. Yet that didn't happen. So the opportunity to discredit the military for its obvious complicity with global terror was avoided. And yet thereby an opportunity was lost to put the military in a much more reasonable position within the Pakistani political structure. So what might bring about a changed condition for a rapprochement with India would be a situation where one could visualize the extraordinary powers and prerogatives of the military being questioned, as happened after 1971 and as did not happen after the Abbottabad episode. Beyond this, there are at least 4 strategies that one can think of, and I'll briefly go over them in terms of dealing with Pakistan in the future. There are some in India, particularly of a liberal political persuasion, who would argue that one should really focus upon people-to-people diplomacy. One should focus on India's extraordinary cultural power and soft power resources, India's significant cultural resources, and thereby seek a rapprochement with Pakistan and there bypassing the military elite. I only wish this were possible. The military elite might tolerate increased cultural contacts, might allow greater people-to-people contacts, but that does not mean it's suddenly going to change their outlook towards India. That remains much more of an obsession and has a much more fixed quality to it. And in any case, there are limits to the cultural exchanges and the flow of people and ideas that the military is likely to permit. So I doubt that this approach of soft power and the deployment of cultural resources can somehow melt the extraordinary grasp that the military still has over the state. Second, there are some who've argued that a strategy of economic interdependence, the increasing integration of markets, the growth of commercial contacts, the expansion of trade, the creation of, and thereby the creation of constituencies for peace on both sides, might ultimately lead to a transformation of the rivalry. I'll just give you one critical episode from 20th century history which completely belies this argument of economic interdependence leading to peace. And the best example is Europe on the eve of World War I. It was one of the most highly economically integrated regions of the world. That did not stop German militarism from rising and from plunging the region into one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century. And I can provide more evidence to this end, but that case is perhaps emblematic of the problematic quality of the argument that economic interdependence is necessarily a basis for peace. Then what might one do with Pakistan? One is a strategy of what political science scholars call, and I refer to in my book, as deterrence by punishment. That any time Pakistan provokes you, be prepared to exact a cost, to inflict pain on Pakistan, as was done quite recently, and to remind Pakistan that behavior of this sort is intolerable, and costs will be inflicted, and the costs will far outweigh any benefits from the initial provocation that Pakistan had engaged in. This strategy has much to recommend to itself, except the drawback with this strategy is that it is fraught with some danger, that one does not know what exactly is the threshold that Pakistan will tolerate before it again tries to resort to nuclear blackmail. And that is a risk that decision makers in this country will have to weigh extremely carefully. That is not a strategy that is to be written off entirely, but it is a strategy that one must think through very, very carefully and not be moved by emotion and passion because of continued Pakistani malfeasances. A better strategy, in my view, which has been attempted by India, but in a most half-hearted fashion, and often in an ad hoc and idiosyncratic fashion, has been what is called a strategy of deterrence by denial. By making it exceedingly difficult to attack targets in India. This is not a perfect strategy, because no strategy of denial can be foolproof. But one can have improved port security. One can have better perimeter security, particularly for vital installations, for military bases, especially those along the border. Fortify them and make them so secure that the ability to carry out terrorist attacks becomes exceedingly difficult. The most dramatic breach of this strategy of deterrence by denial, obviously, was November 2008. And the response to that could not have been worse. And it really laid bare how inept the Indian state had been in terms of ensuring the proper dissemination of the proper collection of intelligence, the dissemination of intelligence, and taking adequate precautions to prevent an attack of that magnitude. Even subsequent to that, it's been 8 years now, India still has extraordinary maritime and land-based gaps which have yet to be adequately addressed. So this strategy of deterrence by denial, to make it extraordinarily costly, to make it extraordinarily difficult for Pakistan to continue with its periodic attempts at the use of terror against India, really is only talked about and implemented in a half-hearted fashion. It needs to be implemented in a far more full-blown fashion and thereby make Pakistan realize the futility of this enterprise over the long term. So at best, what can be attempted is a strategy that limits the kind of damage that this relationship of hostility, which is for the most part one-sided, can at least be contained for the foreseeable future. Thank you.